Well, it's time for another video. Thought I'd try to give you guys a little heads up on something I ran into a while back. It can happen on just about any year model car that's set up so that you got this perfect storm that comes together. And electrical stuff does weird things that will kind of throw you a little bit if you're, you can assume is what I was getting to. And I'll show you what I was talking about here, and I got to get into this because it's going to take me a little while to go through it. This Crown Victoria, this vehicle here was one that belonged to the college, and one of the administrators was driving it, and she said this thing makes racket even after I turn off the key that I'm hearing. And I'm hearing a humming noise. She's talking about it humming. And I was thinking, okay, what in the world is that? I thought maybe it might have been a stuck fuel pump relay or something, because I have seen stuff like that. I had seen, and I had mentioned this one time before, probably a couple of months ago, about a Explorer that I had that was 91 model, and it was dieseling, which is weird for anything that doesn't have a carburetor on it. The reason that Crown Victoria was dieseling was because the power relay was stuck. Well, on a Ford like that, the ignition coil is powered up by ignition switch rather than the power relay. And the power relay still had the engine controller awake, still had the injectors awake, and whenever you'd switch it off when it was good and hot, the injectors just kept putting fuel in there because they were still getting a crank signal because the engine controller was still awake. And I was under the impression I had fixed cars that were dieseling with carburetors on them, so that was the first fuel-injected vehicle I ever fixed that had and I thought about it and figured out what was going on, because there was only one way it would keep delivering fuel, was if the fuel injectors and the engine controller were still powered up. And sure enough, I found a stuck relay. But in this particular case, I was want to talk a little bit about these Crown Victorias. One of my guys that I placed over here at the Ford dealer back in '05, he's still working over, makes really good money. He was telling me that he was at a Ford school, and they said that in the late '80s, when they were developing this 4.6 liter Crown Victoria engine, they would do the stuff like they could do in the laboratory, and they would tune the thing and give it more and more and more horsepower to see what it would take in its regular configuration mechanically, see how much horsepower you could cram into this thing before it tore itself apart. And they kept upping the horsepower and tuning, doing the electronic tuning to get it higher and higher and higher, and delivering more and more fuel to it and all that on the dyno. And they said they jacked it up to nearly 900 horsepower before the thing destroyed itself. And so then they detuned it down to about 200 horsepower, and they wound up with an engine that would last a very long time. Chevrolet made that Vega engine back in the, I guess they designed that thing back in the real early 70s. And that Vega engine was an aluminum block 4-cylinder, and they supposedly tested it in the laboratory for thousands of hours, and it was supposed to be okay. But when you get something out in the field, you find out that how weak or how strong it is. The old Iron Duke cast iron 4-cylinder they had is what they should have put in that Vega, and it would have been a really good car. Of course, the Pinto had an outstanding engine in it back whenever it was, and the Vega were competing with one another. But the doofy people that mounted that engineered the fuel tank straps on that Pinto, made it so when somebody ran into the back of it, the gas tank would fall off and the car would catch fire. And that was the first recall of any vehicle in the United States, was a Ford Pinto. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I read that somewhere a long time ago. Anyway, these vehicles here, when we saw a new platform, we always figured we were going to have to do a lot of work on them to get them straightened out. This particular 4.6 liter was out there 4 or 5 years before we saw hardly any trouble with it in the shop, other than DPFE sensors and stuff like that. Now, also something else that would happen that we had to do quite a lot of straightening out on was the clogging of the EGR. And that was something that we had to deal with on a regular basis. We had to pull that little Cobra neck off and clean that. On those pickup truck engines that were configured differently in the end, they would clog up like this too. All of this, see, the EGR was supposed to flow in here, And when all of that's clogged up with carbon, you get a PO 401 code, which is basically telling you that you don't have any EGR flow. I used to like to open the EGR valve manually with a vacuum pump or whatever, suck on it with a hose on the diaphragm to get it open. And if it didn't lower the, and I did this on GM vehicles too, if it doesn't cause the engine to run rough whenever you start applying EGR, you know that it's clogged. I mean, that those passages are clogged, and that's been a problem. That EGR particulates on GDI vehicles that are equipped with them also contribute to that valve carbon. Of course, PCV steam does a lot of that too. And using the wrong fuel increases PCV vapor load, and there's a whole bunch. But I'm not here to talk about that. All right, so what we have going on here, I also put these plug wires on these vehicles. Those were a lot of fun. You had two coil packs, one on each side, and they were just alike, but they had two sets of numbers on them. And on the Ford, on the passenger side, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the driver's side, you got 5, 6, 7, 8. And so what my buddy Donnie come up with, he says, if you take these Crown Victoria spark plug wires, he said the two shortest ones and the two longest ones go on 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the rest of them go on the other side. And so basically, whenever you find the right towers, you can make that happen. One of the things that was annoying to me is sometimes they'll produce these coil packs has got A's and B's and all that kind of stuff on them instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. Typically A, B, C, and D is 1, 2, 3, 4 when it comes to your cylinders and all that. I don't know who came up with that nonsense, but Toyota likes to do that, and some of the coil manufacturers do it too. Anyway, on this one, the driver reported she heard a humming noise after switching the key off, but the noise had stopped after she cycled the key. All right, was the humming coming from the rear? I asked because I figured maybe the fuel pump relay contacts might be intermittently sticking. I had seen that before, and that was something we needed to check into. No, she said this was coming from the front, but it stopped when I switched the key on. So when you switched on the key, this noise would go away. When you switched it off, this noise would start happening. That sounds absolutely opposite of what we, are used to in this business. Well, the car needed an oil change, so I put it in one of the lifts and I made that happen, knocked that out right quick. And the first thing I noticed was a noise coming from the engine compartment, but it wasn't a hum. It was a cyclic clicking at the rate of about 2 hertz, which would be 2 times per second. Click, 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 click. And boy, this is weird. So I start listening. You know what you do? You're going to start listening for where the click is. I'm sniffing around to see where the click's at, and it only happened with the key off. Turn it on and go away. All right. Now I remembered one day on an Aerostar, one of the new car mechanics came over there. This guy named Terry Parker. He worked over there. I could tell you some more funny stories about him. He was a great big old boy. He was about 20 years old. He had arms about this big around and everything. But anyway, he was a cool kid. I really liked him. And he says, I've got a Windstar over here. I mean, not a Windstar, but an Aerostar, a Ford Aerostar. And he says, and the high beam indicator is blinking off and on. And he said, I don't know what in the world would cause that. He said, I've worked on it and checked it. And I said, well, I don't know. I gave him a couple of pointers. I don't remember what I told him. Finally, he just gave up on it. He goes, can you come over and look at this thing? And so I said, well, it was blinking like a turn signal indicator. That blue high beam indicator was. And I said, so what in the world would cause the high beam indicator to blink on, off, on, off, on, off? I mean, it was a perfect cycle. Just like I was talking about on the Crown Victoria, except it was only the high beam indicator. And this was a brand new vehicle. It was brand new off the lot. It had not even been sold to anybody yet. All right, so maybe the daytime running light module? No, I didn't even have daytime running light. So what in the world is going on here? All right, what I found out was when I reached my hand around the back of the instrument cluster and put my finger on this bulb socket, it was for that high beam indicator, and just pulled in on it a little bit, it stopped flashing. And it was one of those things you could not duplicate this if you tried, by even tweaking those little things. But these little brass contacts go against these on that thing right there. And so when it was flashing, I reached behind the cluster and pressed that. So these little contacts right here, apparently one of them was barely touching, and when it would get hot, it would do that, which is really weird that it would even do that, you know. But that's the only time I've ever seen that in my whole career. But it was one of those very strange things. And this problem reminded me of that, but I couldn't imagine why it would be doing something like that under the hood and all that. And so I could hear two of these relays here clicking like regularly. One of them was the power relay and the other was the fuel pump relay. They were the ones that were clicking off and on. Boy, this is just driving me up the wall. You know, I got to find out what's wrong with this. I was there by myself. I wouldn't have any students there or anything, so I was able to think clearly and zero in on it. All right, so I don't want to disturb things too much, else the problem might evaporate. So I hooked up the scope, and I found a pattern that looked like that on several different pins. I mean, there were several different pins that I found problems like that on. All right, camera, start focusing better. You can do better than that. Hello, focus. All right, I guess I'm going to get back in front of it and get it to focus on me again. There we go. Sorry about that, y'all. It's really something to get a $1,000 camera and it don't know how to focus. But long and short of it was, that's what I was seeing. All right, now you might remember that thing, that story I told a while back, under the shade tree. I had on this, when I was working on this buddy's pickup of mine out there, it wound up having a bad engine controller that was buzzing the ignition coil and a bunch of the relays under the hood and all that kind of stuff. And his dad had a pickup that was the same year model and everything, same motor, all that, and same calibration. And I had taken this engine controller and put it on his dad's pickup, which is wise to do that if you're going to do some swapping, because if you put a bad engine controller on a good truck, you're not likely to damage the good truck. If you put a good engine controller on a bad truck and something on a bad truck fried the engine controller, you may fry the engine controller and have two trucks that you've bricked. Anyway, that one had a bad engine controller. And so I checked the battery ground cable just to be sure, had the engine block and the PCM ground over here, and everything was just fine. It was time to peek into parameters to see what kind of clues was going on. Back to square one. So I got this old new generation star tester. I love that thing. I was using it when it was brand new, and they're all gone now, I imagine, pretty much. They cost a couple of $1,000s by the time they quit making them. Hickok was making those. It's really a good tool. Anyway, the clicking always stopped with the key switched on. I didn't find anything except a P1288 trouble code telling me the cylinder head temperature sensor had at some point recorded a reading that was too hot. Now this was a clue, but I didn't realize it at the time. So I decided if this thing tried to run hot, I need to figure out what's going on with that. So that was my first real clue. Now, it showed me a normal reading with a cold engine, which was about 3.6 volts, but I wanted to know more than that. That was with a key on. Now, the memory code was a necessary rabbit trail. I should have done a key on engine off test anyway, but I got sidetracked when I decided to check the coolant, which as it turned out to be mysteriously low. That was another clue. It was pointing me in the direction of what was wrong, but I was going to have to keep digging until I found it. All right. So I added about a gallon of coolant, made a mental note that I needed to keep track of the coolant level, ran it for a little while, monitored the coolant temperature on the NGS, didn't see any alarming numbers, no compression in the coolant. I switched the key off, and there was that ticking again. All right. So I was gathering information way too fast. And I just figured, well, I've got another engine controller over here. I went to the trouble to swap the engine controller out and do the key learn thing, but it still did the same thing. Click, 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 and I said, okay, we're not an engine controller issue on this one like we had on the other truck. The truck, the 91 model truck I worked on. So I got away from that, swapped it back out. But I reflected on my scope readings. And the pins I had taken those readings, I realized that pins 71 and 97 were showing unusual voltage activity that would explain why all the other pins were so lively. I was getting close to that. There's 71 and 97. If you're familiar with these 104 pin engine controllers, the powers are right here and the grounds are clustered in this area over here. Usually these 5 pins right here will be ground. It'll vary a little bit from one engine controller to the other, but you get my point. Anyway, so I said, I'm going to home in on this. I started pulling the fuses until the clicking stopped. While I was over there, I noticed a smell. I noticed something burning. You know, this burning smell? I never smelled it on the other side of the engine compartment. I only smelled it where I got over here by the power distribution center where I was pulling these fuses. Alright, about 8 inches behind the PDC is this high current relay center, which has the starter relay and the fan relay. There was a cover on that relay. It clicked on it, so I couldn't see the relays until I removed it, and this is what I found. That relay right there was burned up, and it even destroyed its little relay box and all that. So the one that a fuse I pulled that made it stop was one that supplies this relay. So how did that factor into the clicking? Alright, so what we got going on here was the PCM power relay was basically clicking on and off. Alright, so your cooling fan relay, because of the fact that it was shorted, it was back feeding power to the EEC circuit. That would energize the PCM, which would energize the fuel pump relay, but there wasn't enough current there to carry the fuel pump. And so when the fuel pump kicked on, it would open the the PCM power relay back up. Alright, and so here's what that was looking like. Alright, now whenever you, this was shorted, this wire right here was shorted to that wire after the way this thing was destroyed. And whenever you switched on the key, that one, which basically it would stop all this because the PCM power relay would override it. But when you switched off the key, this would click on the PCM power relay. It just kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I'm sorry, the cooling fan relay, cooling fan high relay, and then there's a cooling fan low relay. But all this stuff was powered up because of a short right there that was happening right here. I could go into a lot more trouble. See, here's the 71 that was powered up by that. When that 71 powered up, it was operating the fuel pump. Now I don't have that on this schematic, but whenever the fuel pump would kick on, that's what would happen. But the code and the low coolant were related to this burned out relay because the engine had heated up enough to where it pushed some coolant out the pressure cap. Fan wouldn't work because the relay was shorted, the engine was getting hot in traffic, and that percolated the coolant. The relay tipped its hand by cycling the PCM, and the fuel pump and giving off that burning smell. This would be a day long remembered, to quote Star Wars. Anyway, I got a whole high current relay center. I had a police car that was exactly the same year model that had been given to me by the city. That was an old raggedy wore out thing at the time even. And I went to that police car and I took that high current relay center and I snipped it off of there, the whole thing, and then I soldered and heat shrink and mounted it on that Crown Victoria that belonged to the college, and it ran like a brand new car. And that car, as far as I know, is still running today. After I replaced that relay center and all that, but that totally straightened that out. When I was talking about that Aerostar, I remembered a little something that was an interesting little story. I went down to, this parts guy came out there and he says, this guy down at this dealership in Florida, a little dealership in North Florida, which wasn't but about an hour and a half, 2 hours from where we were at the most. Well, I don't know, I think it was probably an hour I could drive to get down there. But the point is, he said he only had a couple of mechanics down there, and the dealership was in an old brick building. And so the guy that was the service manager / general manager, whatever, said, we've got a Aerostar down here that won't start. And what we need for you to do is come down here and look at this thing, if you will. I'll make it worth your while. And get this thing started, because we sold it and these people only drove it a week before it got to where it wouldn't start, and our mechanics down here have run out of ideas and they don't know what to do. And so I said, well, I'll drive down there and check it out, because he kept saying, I'll make it worth your while, I'll make it worth your while. And I don't know how many times I've been told that, and then whenever you get through, it's really wasn't worth your while what they wanted to pay you, because you already got it fixed. Anyway, I drove down there, and when I walked in there wearing my uniform, these I got the cold shoulder from those two mechanics. It was an older man and a younger man, because they thought I was there trying to get a job, and I was going to cut into their work and all that. Well, the guy that called me to come down there said, push this thing back away from the wall, he's going to work on this, and he's going to see if he can get it started for us. And so it was 88 model, I think. That's how many years ago this has been. And so you remember the spark output connector on the forge. If that thing shorted power or ground any kind of way, you won't have any kind of spark. And so they walked away and went back to what they were doing. And you know, I looked at that. I checked. They had already put a distributor in it and whatnot, and you know, trying to just peck around, figure out what was wrong. And so one of the first things the shop manual tells you to do if you've got a no spark situation is pull the spout connector. So I pulled the spout connector and it fired up. So it took me about 90 seconds to get it started. They went rushing over there to see what I had done. And then we determined that the spark output circuit was shorted inside the engine controller. So I said, well, that's what's wrong with it. It needs an engine controller. So I took the engine controller. Well, I walked up front to the parts room where this girl was working behind a parts counter. And I'm telling you, this was a dusty old warehouse looking place. It was a, you know, of course, you know, we're talking 1980s anyway, you know. And so I came in and I said, we need to order an engine controller for this. You know, the other two mechanics were hovering right close by. And she says, I need the number off the old one. I said, no, you don't. And she had these books, these ESIDS books that Ford used to publish that had the part numbers and calibration information for all the different vehicles for every year model. You know, I used to have those books over at my service bay on a bookshelf because they were really handy and it saved you trouble at the parts counter. And I said, give me that book right over there. It says 1988 ESIDS. So she threw it on the counter and I flipped it open and I found the calibration of that Aerostar and I said, that's the part number for the engine controller right there. And but I mean, I don't know what she was using those books for, but she wouldn't even let the mechanics touch them. She had them in the parts room, and they're for the mechanics. They're not for the parts people. Anyway, so I went in there and I says, well, I got you going, I think. You know, them guys were, you know, cleaning this thing up and buckling everything down, putting the doghouse back on it, the engine cover to get it ready to deliver to the customer, who was about ready to sell the thing back to Ford, I think. And the guy says, and I says, where is the guy that owns this dealership? He says, oh, he's out there on a tractor picking his peanuts. And he said, I'm just running the dealership for him. Anyway, I says, hey, I says, well, you said you was going to make it worth my while. I'm going to stand here and find out what you're doing to make it worth my while. He opened a Prince Albert cigar box that he had there in one of his desk drawers, and he gave me two $20 bills. Wasn't a big deal. But it was a grand adventure, and I kind of enjoyed it. I didn't hold it against the guy, but one way or another, that's all I got for you on this video today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got something out of it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me tell my stories, and I'll see you next time.